We are paid, that's all. We are God.
Hey guys! The video for today will be the part 9 of What If Naruto Traveled to the World of Harry Potter. The trust of a child is a fragile thing. Naruto becomes disenchanted with Konoha and the Sandaime Hokage when he stumbles upon the truth of who and what he is on his 8th birthday. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe and check the author in the description. Let's start. Chapter 32, Mission's End. Tuesday, August 12, 2003, late afternoon. Tazuna's home, Nami no Kuni. Once he'd finished viewing the final memory that he'd drawn from the latest prisoners, Harry sealed away the memory and stretched out his stiff and sore muscles. He then dug out another pain potion from the pocket of his cloak, which he'd dug out of his pack on his way to draw the newest prisoner's memories, and downed the potion. A soft sigh escaped from his lips as the lingering ache from his misadventure the previous afternoon melted away. Harry then quickly gathered up his collection of scrolls containing all of the memories he'd spent the day viewing, sorting, and storing and dropped down to put them away. His next task was to sit down and write out another report for the Hokage. He also requested permission to transport their shinobi prisoners and Gato back to Konoha and briefly mentioned the lack of a local authority to which they could turn the hired mercenaries over to once they'd been captured. Right after he finished his report and had it shipped back to Konoha via house elf, Harry spent several minutes writing down the information he'd gleaned from all of the memories that he'd drawn from all of their prisoners so that he could make adjustments to the plans that he and his teammates had made to take down Gato Corporation. That information included the general layout of Gato's base, the location of his safes, the lock combinations for each of said safes, the location of any incriminating documents, the entrances to the smuggler's tunnels where he stored the drugs, contraband, and stolen artifacts and merchandise that his company sold on the side, the guard rotations, and the total number of mercenaries, bandits, and shinobi, both the legitimate ones and the rogue agents, that he'd hired. When he was finished with that, Harry began working out several different potential plans for dealing with the hired thugs and shinobi that were currently on the island. The latter group would be fairly easy to deal with, once they were subdued, as they would all be sent to Konoha so that the Hokage could decide their fates. The former group, however, could present a bit of a problem if the Hokage confirmed Izumo's prediction that Konoha wouldn't want to deal with them. If he and his teammates were left to dispose of them, then Harry was going to have to find a way to weed out those that could be redeemed from the cutthroats and mercenaries. He knew that some of them were undoubtedly good people that had been forced to do terrible things for some reason or another, and if he simply just killed them all, then he would be forever haunted by a guilty conscience. Harry may not have an issue with taking a life during a fight, but there was no way he could execute any prisoners without making certain none of them had been forced into the life of a criminal against their will. He had never forgotten his godfather's plight, and he could never sentence anyone to death, or imprisonment, without a trial because of what had happened to Sirius. Harry was just considering the benefits of sending his elves to purchase a large enough supply of Veritaserum to dose each and every single hired mercenary in Gato's army, in order to weed out the true criminals from those who made a bad decision or were forced into their current position. When he received a reply from the Hokage, the wizard accepted the sealed scroll from the elf with trepidation, a scroll that would determine just how much blood would stain his soul before the end of the mission. After a full minute had passed, he sighed and released the seal with a smear of blood and a pulse of chakra so that he could read the message inside. Takeshi, accommodations are currently being prepared for the shinobi prisoners that you and your teammates have captured to date or will capture shortly, along with one for Gato, Senshu. Once the holding cells have been prepared, transportation scrolls will be created and sent to you. Furthermore, arrangements were made with the fire daimyo to deal with the hired mercenaries and civilian criminals that are part of Gato's forces after your first report. Additional transportation scrolls will be sent to you once I receive notification from the daimyo's court confirming that they are prepared to handle the estimated numbers that you provided in your most recent report. The first shipment of relief supplies are currently being gathered and loaded into the wagons that you graciously offer to supply for ease of transport. We will send you the supplies and a handful of medical personnel to treat those villagers in need of medical attention with an escort the moment you have confirmed that all hostile shinobi on the island have been contained. Sarutobi Hiruzen, Sandaime Hokage of Konohagakure, Harry felt as if a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders the moment he read through the line about arrangements having been made to deal with the civilian thugs. He really hadn't wanted to be forced to execute any prisoners through his oath, orders from the Hokage ironclad unless they would harm the village or his family. And removing potential threats would neither harm the village nor his family even if it would traumatize him. Feeling infinitely better, Harry rolled up the missive and tucked it into his cloak pocket so he could pass it to Izumo and Kotetsu when they returned. The wizard then returned to his planning. He would work uninterrupted for another hour before a flying sandal announced the arrival of the young Inari. Harry caught the flying footwear just before it would have clocked him upside the head and side before he leaned down over the roof of the makeshift prison to see what the Gaki wanted. He was slightly surprised to see the boy smirking at him for once, since the 8-year-old usually scowled at him. A single shoe still isn't going to do me much good, even if it is almost my size this time. Okayasan sent me to tell you that supper will be ready shortly and to warn you that she will be very cross if you skip another meal. Harry blinked in surprise over the second half of the message before he asked, "Your mother told you to tell me that she would be upset with me if I didn't show up for supper?" "Yes. She's already mad at you because you snuck out of bed this morning. She's also mad that you skipped both breakfast and lunch today because you missed lunch and supper yesterday." This time Harry shook his head over the strangeness of having a woman who couldn't be more than 5, maybe 6, years older than him going into mother hen mode on him. It wasn't even as if she was an old friend that had grown up with him, like Hermione, or an old friend of his parents that saw him as a connection to the past. Maybe there was a gender-specific instinct that all women carried inside of them that was activated upon obtaining motherhood or upon seeing blood. At least Tsunami wasn't quite as smothering as Mrs. Weasley tended to get, not that Harry had really ever minded it all that much when Molly coddled him a bit. "And the reason why you felt the need to throw a shoe at me again?" Harry inquired as he refocused his attention on the 8-year-old that was still smirking up at him. "You didn't answer when I called you," Inari replied with a shrug of his shoulders and without a trace of remorse. Harry snorted because the slight smug cast to the kid's smirk suggested he hadn't tried very hard to get Harry's attention before he launched his mother's sandal at his head. He couldn't find it in him to be angry though. It was something that Naruto would have done in the kid's place, and had done on more than one occasion, though Naruto tended to throw pranks instead of shoes. "Please let your mother know that I will join your family for supper once my teammates have escorted your grandfather home for the evening." "Why can't you tell her that?" "I suppose I could, but then I'd have to tell her about the shoes you keep launching at my head." "What would your mother think of you attacking an injured man?" "Ah no, that's alright, you don't have to tell Kazan anything. I'll go let her know you'll join us for supper tonight right now," Inari cried as he immediately took off running for the house as if his feet were on fire. "Works like a charm every time," Harry chuckled to himself in English as he returned his attention back to his planning one more. Nothing was more effective for acquiring a moment of peace than threatening the one breaking the peace with their mother, or other parental figure, unless it was to threaten them with embarrassing pranks. Sunday, August 17, 2003, early evening. Former daimyo's residence, Nami no Kuni. Harry sealed away the last of the money and documents that he'd pulled out of the safe in the former daimyo's office that Gato had used to store his valuables inside. Once that was done, the 23-year-old took a long look around the office for anything he might have missed before he left the room to continue his search of the modest mansion. As he traveled down the hall towards what he knew was the master bedroom, Harry mentally ran through the list of tasks that still needed to be completed before his current mission could be considered completed. At the top of the list was guarding Tazuna until construction on the bridge was complete, a job that would last at least another 2 or 3 days according to Tazuna's estimates. Next was rounding up the last of the hired mercenaries that were scattered about the island, most of them hidden within the tunnels that riddled the archipelagic nation. Harry's clones were hunting through the underground maze for the hidden bases at that very moment, but it would still take time to flush the thugs out since he and his teammates were already spread thin. And the final task was to finish collecting the evidence against Gato, which Harry hoped to have finished within the next hour or two. Pleased with the fact that they were mostly finished the mission, Harry mentally reviewed everything that had happened over the past 5 days. After Harry had spent the entirety of the 12th going through memories and making plans, the 3 Chunin had spent 3 days systematically hunting down and capturing the 5 remaining shinobi that had been hired by Gato alongside Zabuza and the Oni, Kyudai. The hardest part had been finding the 5 of them, as they'd gone to ground the moment they discovered Zabuza's ransacked room mere hours after Harry had captured the Oni Kyudai. Taking those 5 shinobi into custody had been a piece of cake, none of them anywhere near the level of Zabuza or the Demon Brothers. It helped that they were facing 3-to-1 odds each time they located one of the enemy shinobi. The three Chunin had trusted Harry's Kage Bunshin to watch over Tazuna and his family while they took down the enemy. As soon as all 5 shinobi had been captured, Harry had sent notice to the Hokage. The Hokage in return had sent the promised transportation scrolls that would transport all 10 of the high-profile prisoners, the 9 shinobi in Gato, to Konoha, and word that the supply caravan had left Konoha. Once those 10 prisoners were gone, Harry had converted the temporary prison he'd made into one large holding cell that could hold up to 200 people. The trio had then begun rounding up the bandits and mercenaries that had been hired by Gato. It had only taken 2 days to round up 3/4 of the hired thugs, as the trio caught them completely by surprise thanks to the clones that had infiltrated the various bases that had been set up throughout the island. Those they hadn't caught during those 2 days had been out on patrol at the time their base was raided or down in the tunnels. When they weren't scouring the island for the scattered mercenaries, the 3 young men took the time to interview the villagers, gathering more information on Gato's many crimes, collecting the names and detailed descriptions of those who had gone missing, and confirming the rough census that Tazuna and Tsunami had provided. Once the majority of the mercenaries had been neutralized, Harry had made plans to raid the former daimyo's estate to collect Gato's personal effects that afternoon. Kotetsu and Izumo had come with him, the 2 older Chunin remaining outside to stand guard and search the grounds for the unmarked grave of the daimyo and his family. So far, Harry had spent close to 3 hours searching the house and sealing away anything and everything that could be linked back to Gato or Gato Corporation. The only 2 rooms left to search were the master bedroom and the basement. As soon as Harry stepped into the master bedroom, he refocused on the task at hand and created a pair of Kage Bunshin to help him gather up and seal all of Gato's clothes into a scroll. While they were doing that, Harry drew his holly wand and began summoning the stolen trinkets, incriminating documents, and other valuables that Gato had kept in the room. Once the spell no longer drew a response, Harry quickly sealed everything away before he searched the room for the safe he'd seen in Gato's memories so that he could empty it as well. "Aren't you finished yet, Takashi?" Izumo demanded as he stuck his head in the room just as Harry finished clearing out the safe, nearly earning a stunner in the face when he startled the magical Jinchuriki. "Just the basement left to search now," Harry replied as he resheathed his wand. "Did you and Tetsu find the daimyo's grave?" We think so, though the bodies were too far decayed to accurately identify him or the other 4 bodies that had been buried in the same grave." "Not completely unexpected when you consider the fact that they'd been buried without a coffin," Harry murmured as he suppressed a shudder of distaste. The idea of half-rotten corpses bringing to mind the inferi that he'd encountered in the seaside cave that Dumbledore had taken him to at the end of his 6th year. "I can call his spirit back to this plane to confirm the location of his and his family's grave now that I know the man's full name. Does that mean he'll be sticking around like the Yondaime?" "No, Minato is a special case. I haven't found a way to get rid of him yet. I feel so unloved," Minato deadpanned as he appeared beside Harry the moment his name had been spoken. "Not my fault that you're dead boring, cousin," Harry quipped with a smirk at the deceased blonde. Ha, lovely pun, did you think that up all by yourself?" Minato snarked back with a barely disguised snort of amused exasperation. "I think I much preferred it when you were far too respectful of my feelings to resort to gallows humor. Need I remind you that you're the one that told me to stop tiptoeing around the topic of death in your current state? I never thought you'd take that as permission to openly joke and tease me about my death." "Don't pretend you don't enjoy my morbid sense of humor," Harry countered as he joined Izumo in the hall outside the room with a pouting Minato trailing along behind him. "So, did you want help searching the basement?" Izumo inquired after he'd stopped chuckling at the 2 cousins, the older man long used to Harry interacting with the dead shade. "Or are you going to summon the dead daimyo first?" "I'm not prepared to summon the daimyo just yet," Harry replied as he briefly thought of the resurrection stone that was securely hidden behind the strongest wards he could produce back in Konoha alongside of his cloak. He'd stopped carrying those 2 items when he first started taking missions outside of Konoha for fear that he'd lose either of them in a fight or that the cloak would be damaged. "Actually, I won't be able to call on his spirit until we return to Konoha because I had not planned to call upon the dead while I was here in Nami. And I wouldn't mind having a hand with the basement, if you're sure Tetsu-senpai won't fall asleep without you there to slap him awake." "Kotetsu will be fine on his own for a bit. He has a couple of your clones to keep him from falling asleep out of pure boredom," Izumo replied with a snicker. Harry laughed as the 2 of them moved through the mansion towards the kitchen where the entrance to the basement was located. It would take the two Chunin roughly 45 minutes to pack up the smuggled and stolen goods that were stored in the room. The last thing they did before they headed out to join Kotetsu was to seal up the hidden entrance to the underground tunnels that was located in the basement in order to prevent any of the thugs still running loose from retaking the daimyo's residence now that it had been cleared. The two of them then joined Kotetsu outside in time to see him securing a couple of drunken bandits that had apparently walked right into him. Just before they left the area with their latest prisoners, Harry sent a couple of clones to ward the grounds of the daimyo's residence to further secure it against future intrusions. They would arrive back at Tazuna's house just after supper, and Harry left Kotetsu and Izumo to sweet-talk Tsunami into forgiving them for being late while he hauled their latest prisoners off to the rather crowded holding cell. The Hokage had not yet sent the transport scrolls that had been promised for the civilian thugs. Inari would deliver Harry's supper to him, along with the now standard accompanying sandal to the head, not that the kid had yet managed to actually clock Harry with one of the offending shoes. Just 10 minutes later, Harry teasingly told the kid he threw like a girl and subsequently earned a pouting glare in return before the kid bravely dared, more like demanded, Harry to teach him how to throw properly. Surprised at Inari's boldness, Harry silently regarded the 8-year-old while he ate a couple of bites, noting the determined glint in the kid's eyes. He then agreed to show the kid how to throw once he'd finished his food. Tsunami found them 30 minutes later, and the older women lit into Harry like nobody's business when she saw that Harry was teaching Inari how to throw a kunai, after he'd given the kid a few pointers on throwing shoes and rocks. He couldn't fault the woman for being angry. He should have gotten her permission before teaching her son anything, but in his defense, the kid was rather stubborn and had not been satisfied just learning how to throw sandals. Harry apologized for overstepping his boundaries but refused to apologize for trying to teach the kid how to protect himself. He knew far too well what it felt like to be young and defenseless in a dangerous world. That would be the last time Harry saw more than a glimpse of Inari for the remainder of his mission. Tsunami had forbidden her son from having anything further to do with the three shinobi. Harry wouldn't have much time to feel guilty about getting the kid in trouble with his mother. He was far too busy planning a raid on the underground tunnels as he pored over the rough map he'd made of the natural maze that sat beneath the island so that the last of the mercenaries could be rounded up. The biggest problem would be sealing up all of the potential escape routes in order to prevent any of the thugs from getting away once he and his teammates started striking each of the designated bases in the hidden labyrinth. They had sealed up several entrances to the tunnels over the past several days, but Harry wasn't arrogant or naive enough to think they'd found all of the exits. And while he could theoretically spam the entire network of tunnels with clones, that didn't mean that was the smart thing to do. Clones weren't the answer to everything, and if he didn't make an attempt to solve the problem without abusing the Kage Bunshin no Jutsu, then he'd never grow above his current level. Besides, he was already using the clones extensively to watch over the bridge and Tazuna's house as well as searching the island for more entrances. And he didn't need the extra headache of trying to sort out memories on the fly while trying to catch the bandits, since he'd undoubtedly miss something and end up in a worse situation, because that was when his luck would invert again. When he wasn't making plans, with the frequent input from his teammates, he was either on the bridge watching over Tazuna and the rest of the workers or patrolling the village on the off chance that one of the hired thugs turned up to harass the villagers, jobs that he shared with both Kotetsu and Izumo. Neither job was very demanding, but that didn't mean that the three Chunin didn't take their duties seriously. Even Kotetsu stayed alert despite how boring it was to patrol the bridge and village. Regardless of what Harry was doing, his mind continued to plot out his team's next move. By the time the three Chunin returned to Tazuna's house around supper time that night, Harry had tentative plans in place to deal with the last 24 or so mercenaries that were still on the island. He would bounce his idea off of his teammates while he cooked their supper, Harry feeling far too leery of Tsunami's temper to even think of imposing on the small family's hospitality at the moment. By the time they finished eating, the three of them had made solid plans to infiltrate the tunnels an hour before sunrise the next morning. Their plans would be derailed a half an hour later by the arrival of another letter from the Hokage accompanied by a large scroll holding 175 transportation seals. According to the Hokage's letter, the seals couldn't be activated until after 7 o'clock the next morning, when the fire daimyo's guards would be in position to receive the prisoners. Each seal would also need to be activated in 2-minute intervals to allow the guards enough time to secure each prisoner before the next one was transported. That meant that it would take close to 6 hours to transport all of the mercenaries that they'd captured to date. After a short discussion, it was decided that they would put off their raid on the tunnels for a day so that Kotetsu and Izumo could ship off the prisoners while Harry watched over the bridge and the bridge builder and his clones patrolled the village. Bright and early the next morning, Harry saddled Felix when he noted the gelding was more than a little restless due to the fact that he'd been pastured on a lead line since the day they'd arrived. Harry would then ride double with Tazuna to the bridge in order to both save time and allow Felix to burn off a bit of energy. Once they arrived at the bridge, Harry would leave a couple of dozen clones to watch over Tazuna, the workers that turned up to work on the bridge, and the village while he cantered along the length of the not quite finished bridge to check the integrity of the temporary wards that he'd placed on the structure. Once he'd ridden the length twice, he dropped down to the ocean's surface, the wizard circulating his chakra through the gelding once more, in order to check on the ward stones he'd placed in the water. That process involved summoning the numerous rocks he'd sunk with the ward runes on them so that he could check them for damage and return them back to their original places. The current had shifted the stones over the time they'd been in the water. It was a task that would take Harry most of the morning to finish. The magical shinobi would then return topside to join Tazuna at the construction zone for lunch. Harry had just finished tying the reins of Felix's bridle to one of the steel beams when several of the workers called out in alarm. The wizard automatically brought to the very edge of the unfinished bridge before he'd even finished consciously registering their cries so that he could find out what had frightened the men. He had half-drawn both of his wakizashi blades from their sheaths on his back before he registered exactly what it was that he was seeing. The moment he saw the makeshift wooden bridge connecting the unfinished end of the bridge to the shore of Hai no Kuni, he knew that there was no danger. There was only one man that he knew who could grow his own bridge, and neither Harry nor the workers need fear him. Sliding his blades back into their scabbards, Harry relaxed and addressed the workers. "You can relax, gentlemen. You're in no danger from the new arrivals. How can you be so sure?" A rather scruffy-looking man demanded as he scowled at Harry before casting another worried glance at the newly grown extension. "Because the man leading them is my Jounin Ticho," Harry replied as the rumble of wagon wheels on wood reached his ears. "And he is escorting the much-needed food and medical supplies that Konoha sent to relieve the suffering that Nami no Kuni has endured while under Gado's tyrannical control. There will be..." The rest of Harry's words were cut off as the 23-year-old was tackled by a blue, orange, and blonde blur with a loud cry of "Nizan." Team Kakashi had, apparently, been assigned as part of the escort along with Yamato, and it had been Naruto that had tackled the green-eyed shinobi. Housei and Midori soon joined the impromptu dogpile. It had been well over 2 weeks since the three genin had seen the Chunin, and they had apparently missed him a bit. Those 17 days were also the longest time that Harry had been separated from Naruto since the day they'd met one another. Harry laughed beneath the three teens as he distributed noogies and hugs in equal measure. He'd missed them just as much as they'd missed him. "Did you purposefully go looking for trouble the moment I left, or was this just more of your usual luck?" Yamato demanded in exasperation as he walked up beside the quartet and towed Harry's leg with his foot. "Kotetsu got bored and my luck took care of the rest," Harry quipped back with a snort as he freed himself from the kids so he could stand back up. He'd barely regained his feet before Naruto latched onto him once more, the blonde burying his face in Harry's side as he wrapped his arms around Harry's waist. "To tell you the truth, I'm just thankful that it was our team that got this mission. I shudder to think of what might have happened if Kakashi had shown up first that day and had been assigned as Tazuna-san's escort instead. I was rather impressed when I learned that the three of you captured Momochi Zabuza alive," Kakashi interjected as the group moved to one side to allow the two wagons carrying the promised supplies to trundle past them, both wagons being driven by one of Naruto's shadow clones. Zabuza and his accomplice were a piece of cake when compared to the Oni Kyudai, Harry countered with a slight scowl. "Those two bastards damn near killed me when I ran into them while I was alone. Nanny!" Naruto yelled as he jerked back and stared up at Harry in horror. "A pair of Chunin shouldn't have given you that much trouble," Yamato stated with a frown. "It wasn't their skills that nearly killed me, it was the poison they coated their blades in. Well, that and the blood loss I was suffering from and the fact that I was tired at the time," Harry explained as he led the group back to where he'd left Felix, his eyes noting the 24 uniformed guards wearing the sigil of the fire daimyo, the 4 green-clad medics, and 2 masked umbu guards that had accompanied the supply caravan. "If I'd been wearing my cloak during the encounter, then they'd have never cut me up as bad as they had, since the cloak would have deflected more than half of their attacks. Unfortunately, I'd left my cloak behind when I infiltrated Zabuza's base that day and the two brothers caught me as I left." "Why weren't Kotetsu and Izumo with you?" Naruto demanded as he briefly scowled at Harry before he began searching for the two men in question. "Where are they anyway? Shouldn't they be here too? They were guarding our client the day I ran into the Oni Kyudai, and they spent this morning shipping our prisoners off to their guest quarters. As entertaining as it would be to watch you prank Kotetsu and Izumo for not keeping your cousin out of trouble, we still have a job to complete," Kakashi pointed out as he deftly began herding the three genin in the direction of the still-moving wagons. "Our job is to protect the medics and the supplies. You can finish catching up with Takashi later. How many more mercenaries are still running free? And do you know where their base camp is located?" Yamato inquired as the three genin reluctantly allowed their jounin to shuffle them off. "Roughly 24, and they are scattered throughout the network of tunnels that run beneath the entire island. We had originally intended to flush them out this morning, but we had to postpone our plans in order to transport those thugs that we'd already caught to the capital. Are you going to be taking over command of this mission now?" "No, I'm here to help rebuild portions of Nami no Kuni's capital and to provide backup should you need help in rounding up the last of the bandits. Once Team Kakashi has finished overseeing the distribution of the supplies that were sent, they'll be available to help as well." "I see," Harry mused with more than a little relief. Having 5 extra bodies would make rounding up the last of the thugs a bit easier. "Ano, just out of curiosity, why are Daimyo's men here?" "The guards are here to keep order and help re-establish the former government. That will include organizing an election for citizens of Nami to elect a new daimyo to replace the previous lord." Yamato stuck around a few minutes longer in order to gather a little more information before he headed into town, where he would grow a small hospital to house the sick and injured while the team of medic Nin treated them. Harry watched his friend and captain walk away for a moment before he returned his attention to his mission. As he stood guard over Tazuna that afternoon, Harry felt far more at ease than he had since the day he'd first learned that the bridge builder had lied about the mission. Until Yamato and Team Kakashi had arrived, Harry hadn't even realized just how stressed he'd felt over being separated from his family for so long. The final 4 days of the mission would pass by in a blur for Harry. Most of that first night had been spent filling Yamato and Team Kakashi in on the details of what had happened on the mission once everyone had finished their assigned tasks for the day. The following day would be spent rounding up the last of the mercenaries and shipping them off to Hai no Kuni's capital, where they would be held for trial. Harry would then spend most of the 21st pulling down his wards from around the island, while Yamato grew a new grocery store, a bank, a new schoolhouse, 2 hotels, and a small police/guard station for the daimyo's men. Team Kakashi had spent that time helping the medics finish setting up the hospital, tearing down the old grocery store, and helping the villagers clean up the village, Naruto spamming his clones everywhere in order to tackle everything at once while his teammates supervised and coordinated the clones' efforts. Kotetsu had spent the day shadowing Tazuna while Izumo watched over Tsunami and Inari, the bridge builder's daughter and grandson, venturing into town, for the first time since the shinobi arrived in order to help with the cleanup. Tsunami would end up regretting bringing Inari into town with her because the 8-year-old ended up becoming fast friends with Naruto. Apparently, the two boys had bonded over their mutual respect for Harry and the fact that Inari was impressed to finally meet Harry's cousin. Harry would end up being on the receiving end of a second blistering lecture from the woman when Inari boldly announced his desire to become a shinobi that night at supper. The only reason the woman didn't strangle him in her ire was because Tazuna had stepped in to calm his daughter down. Tsunami's adamant refusal to allow Inari to travel to Konoha to take up the life of a shinobi would do an abrupt 180 the very next day when the villagers elected her father as Nami no Kuni's next daimyo upon completion of his bridge. The reason she gave for changing her mind was that her son would need to know how to defend himself from assassination attempts after he had been named his grandfather's heir. He would also need a proper education, something that Nami couldn't provide for him in its current condition. The woman had cornered Harry yet again after that in order to tell him that she would hold him personally responsible for her son's health and education. Harry didn't hesitate to agree to watch over the 8-year-old, he'd grown rather fond of the gaki. The green-eyed chunin would also end up as a temporary guardian for another 3 orphans that were roughly the same age as Tazuna's grandson that same day once word got out that he would be sponsoring Inari's enrollment in Konoha's Shinobi Academy. The villagers hoped that the orphans would have an easier life in the larger village, with the added bonus that if they ever returned to Nami, they would bring with them the training necessary to help them protect the village from future tyrants. A scenario that would more than likely come to pass, as they would only be required to serve on Konoha's shinobi force for a minimum of 5 years if they passed the genin exams once their education was complete due to the fact that they would still be considered citizens of Nami no Kuni. It was an arrangement that had long served those smaller nations that didn't have a hidden village to protect them from outside threats. The completion of the bridge also marked the end of the mission, and teams Yamato and Kakashi would leave first thing the next morning with their 4 charges in tow. The first stop they made as soon as they crossed the bridge, which had been named the Great Naruto Bridge by Inari, much to Harry's bemusement, was to collect the wagon and Shire team that had been left in a secured clearing all of this time. The large group would then spend the next 4 days on the road. Chapter 33, An Eventful Debriefing. Wednesday, August 27, 2003, early afternoon. Konoha no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Harry pulled Felix to a stop just outside of Konoha's main gate and half-turned to face the line of wagons that 3 of his clones were driving. Felix pranced excitedly beneath him and whickered, the gelding well aware that they were nearly home now and eager to rejoin the herd. Reaching down to settle the horse with a gentle pat to his neck, Harry let his eyes run over the 3 pairs of Shire horses that were pulling the wagons to check for any signs of lameness. Once he was certain the horses were still in good condition, if a bit tired and sweaty from working all morning, Harry turned his attention to the 4 children that were soaked in sweat and covered in dirt. The 23-year-old snorted in amusement as the bone-weary children trudged along beside the wagons. They were not quite as enamored of a shinobi's life at the moment. From the moment they had left Nami no Kuni, Harry had had the 4 boys working on their physical condition to prepare them for the day they started at the academy. That included making them walk beside the wagons for most of the journey and run through a mild cardiovascular workout after they made camp each night. The only thing that kept them from whining and complaining was the fact that the 3 genin on Team Kakashi did the same exercises right alongside of them. Naruto had also taken to entertaining the younger boys by telling them stories of all the training he'd done before he'd become a shinobi to keep them from dwelling on their exhaustion and soreness. Harry spared a quick glance at his teammates and Kakashi before he slid down off of Felix's back and passed the reins to a clone that popped into being beside him. The clone then mounted the gelding and let out a sharp whistle that had the 3 wagons splitting off from the group to follow the mounted clone. They would take them home so that the horses could be unharnessed and brushed out before they were released into the pasture for some well-deserved rest. Harry then began leading the group towards the Hokage's tower so the 2 teams could give their reports. The green-eyed Chunin had already written up his report for both the original mission to escort and protect Tazuna and the mission he and his fellow Chunin had been given, to take down Gato Corporation. He would have preferred to send the report through his elves so that he could just go home, but knew the Hokage would be put out if he did that. The man undoubtedly had questions in regards to the mission and the method that he'd used to deliver his missives to Konoha while he was still in Nami. Heaving a silent sigh, Harry pushed down his own exhaustion and glanced back to make certain no one had fallen behind before he climbed up the stairs that wrapped around the outside of the Hokage's tower. 10 minutes later, the 12 of them entered the Hokage's office and the Sandaime put down the report that he'd been reading as he warmly greeted, welcome back Team Kakashi, Team Yamato, and guests. I had wondered when I would be seeing you again. I trust your journey home was uneventful." "Hi, Hokage-sama," Harry murmured in response. Good. "Might I inquire who it is that you've brought with you?" "Of course, Hokage-sama," Harry replied as he gestured for the 4 children to step up beside him. "Allow me to introduce you to Inari, the grandson and heir of the newly elected daimyo of Nami no Kuni, Tazuna the bridge builder." Harry noticed the Sandaimes widen slightly in surprise before he quickly schooled his face back into a polite mask. With him are his friends, Akihiro, Hikaru, and Kazuki. All 4 of these fine young boys asked to accompany us back to Konoha in order to attend the Shinobi Academy. "I see," the Hokage drawled in a thoughtful tone as he briefly inspected the 4 children. "Did their parents write out notification of their consent, or did the boys sneak off without informing their parents of their intentions?" "I have a letter of introduction from Tazuna Dano for all 4 boys granting them permission to attend the academy and assigning temporary guardianship of them to the Namikaze clan. As the head of the Namikaze clan, I agreed to sponsor the children for their enrollment and see to their care for the duration of their enrollment and subsequent tour of duty as a shinobi of Konoha," Harry replied as he passed the sealed letter over to the Hokage. "Should any of the boys fail to obtain a Hitaiate at the end of their education, the Namikaze clan will see to it that they are either escorted back to Nami no Kuni or sponsor them for citizenship in Konoha if they wish to stay." The Sandaime opened the letter and quickly skimmed through its contents before he set it off to one side and studied the 4 nervous children. Harry thought he saw the man's eyes dim briefly when his eyes lingered on the 3 orphans, but it could have been a trick of the light. Very well, I will have their names added to the roster for the next term at the academy. That will give you 3 months to prepare them since the current term is already half over. I will have one of my aides deliver the necessary paperwork that you will need to fill out for their sponsorship and the temporary guardianship to you later this afternoon. You will also need to make an appointment at the hospital for all 4 boys to have a complete physical prior to their first day at the academy. That shouldn't be a problem. Good. Naruto, why don't you and your teammates escort the boys home and get them settled in while I debrief your sensei and the others? The Sandaime suggested as he passed Tazuna's letter of introduction back to Harry so that it didn't get lost amongst the rest of his paperwork. The Hokage waited just long enough for the 4 boys to be escorted from the office by the 3 genin before he asked, which one of you would like to go first? Harry stepped forward after briefly glancing at both jounin present. His would be the longest report because he'd been in charge of the original mission that had ended up dragging the other 2 to Nami no Kuni. Harry did his best to keep his report short and to the point as he covered all of the major points: Zabuza's ambush, Tazuna's confession, infiltrating the shinobi's base, capturing Gato, dealing with the Oni Kyudai, rounding up the bandits, and gathering all of the evidence necessary. There were only 2 bits of information that he left out of his report. The first was the news that the half of the Kyubi that had been sealed inside of him had awakened and that he'd made contact with the creature. He knew he'd eventually have to tell the Hokage about the Kyubi's awakening, but he was not sure if he was ready to deal with the inevitable fallout that revelation would engender. He was also still toying with the idea of waiting until Jiraiya was in town so the Sennin could confirm that the seal was intact to help put paid to any fears that the Hokage or his advisors might have that the Kyubi was close to escaping just because it was now awake. The other bit of information he left out was the bit about him taking memories from the first handful of prisoners. Part of that was because he was not yet ready to divulge all of his skills, he liked having trump cards. Another part was because he was more than a little worried how they would react to the information that Harry could use legilimency as well as copy or modify memories. And the last part was the possibility that the Yamanaka clan might be offended about him using abilities similar to their family abilities or worse, that they might think he copied or stole their abilities for himself. He would have to carefully question Ibiki and Shikaku in order to find out how Inoichi would react before he shared that information, if he ever shared that ability. Once Harry had finished giving his report, Kotetsu and Izumo added a few details that occurred on their watches or during the time that Harry was unconscious due to his injuries. Kakashi stepped forward next to give his report on the escort he provided for the supplies and medics, meeting up with the daimyo's men, distributing the supplies to the villagers, and the political state of the once beleaguered country. Yamato would then go last to give a report on the physical state of Nami, listing the buildings he'd put up for the townsfolk and the villagers' efforts of cleaning up in the wake of Gato's removal. The Hokage would ask several questions once they'd each finished giving their reports before he collected their written reports to add to the notes that he'd taken during their debriefing and the earlier reports that Harry had sent back to the village. The 5 of them were dismissed a moment later. Harry made to leave with his teammates at that point only to find his way blocked by Minato, figuratively speaking since the ghost couldn't really stop him from leaving. You need to inform the Hokage about your encounter with the Kyubi, Minato stated in what Harry had silently dubbed his Hokage voice. I will eventually, Harry replied in English, in order to keep his side of the conversation private since Minato was not currently visible to the room at large, his cousin, still respecting his privacy instead of announcing what had happened to the room at large despite the fact that that was what he wanted Harry to do, as he frowned at his cousin's shade in response to him practically ordering him to share what basically amounted to personal information. No, you need to tell him right now, lest you end up being censured for withholding information. Your position in Konoha is still precarious because of how many secrets you are still keeping, and if you don't tell him now, then it will create all kinds of problems when you do finally bring it up. There is also the fact that you are now a shinobi of Konoha and the status of your seal is serious business. Keeping that information out of your written report is not a big deal, but you'd better come clean now to avoid creating a bigger headache for you and the rest of the family later. Would it really be that big of a deal if I wait until Jiraiya is in the village? Harry inquired with a slight scowl as he ignored the questioning looks of the Hokage, Kakashi, and his teammates as they all stopped to see what was keeping the Chunin. Though it was apparent to everyone present that he was talking to Minato's spirit even if they couldn't see the ghost, they'd seen him talking to the air enough times to realize what was happening. Yes. And you might as well tell your Ticho to stick around for that conversation since the status of your seal will impact future missions. Ah, bloody hell, Harry complained as he crossed his arms. Sometimes I truly wonder what possessed me to take up a hitayate. Is there a problem, Takashi-san? The Sandaime inquired once Harry fell silent. No, not exactly, Harry hedged as he briefly glanced towards Yamato before he swung his gaze to the Hokage. Minato just reminded me about a minor incident that occurred during the mission that I had left out of my report due to personal reasons. He advised me to speak to you and Yamato Taishu about it now, rather than later because of the potential ramifications. The wizard then glanced towards his teammates and Kakashi. I suppose I should include my teammates and Kakashi as well since Kakashi already knows the basics and I'd rather not be pranked for leaving Izumo and Kotetsu out of the loop. And what is so significant about this minor incident that Minato felt the need to prod you into mentioning it? The Hokage inquired as Yamato closed the door and moved back to stand beside Harry while Kakashi, Izumo, and Kotetsu stayed where they were. I didn't fall into true unconsciousness when I passed out after capturing the Oni-Kyudai. Harry explained as he dropped his gaze to the floor to hide his discomfort over the reminder of how much trouble he'd had subduing the two brothers. I did not wish for my Kage Bunshin to dispel since it would have created all kinds of problems due to how many individuals my clones had been impersonating at the time. Instead, I fell into my mindscape and the moment I did, my consciousness and Minato's spirit were drawn into the seal housing the Kyubi. How is that possible? Izumo demanded in surprise before Harry could finish reporting the incident. Doesn't Naruto-kun hold the Kyubi? The short answer is that the Kyubi was split into two entities the night of the attack and there are now two Kyubi in existence. I can give you the full explanation later, Harry promised as he glanced at his teammates. He then turned back to the Hokage to finish his report. As I was saying, Minato and I were drawn into the seal when I fought against falling unconscious and our presence there woke up the Kyubi. I originally planned to wait until Jiraiya was in the village before I said anything though. I wanted him on hand so that he could check the integrity of the seal at the same time. You do realize that attempting to withhold that information looks very bad from this side of the hat, Annie? The Hokage stated in a measured tone and Harry winced even as he nodded. That said, I can understand why you left that tidbit out of your written report and why you wish to wait for Jiraiya to return. I do appreciate the fact that you were willing to listen to Minato in this case. Did you make contact with the Bijou while you were unconscious? Yes, she was not what I expected. She. Kotetsu choked in shock. Yep, it seems that I ended up with the Kyubi's feminine side, Harry drawled with a small smirk. She's still in denial though and for some reason has a real aversion to the color pink. Personally, I think she just dislikes the way the color pink clashes with her flame-colored fur. I thought she looked rather cute with the fluffy pink bows on her neck and all 9 tails. Twin slaps were heard as both Kakashi and Yamato palmed their faces in response to Harry's smart-mouthed quips about the bijou contained within him. The Hokage looked rather constipated and his skin was the pasty gray-green of someone who was feeling distinctly ill and on the verge of throwing up. Izumo and Kotetsu in the meantime were silently flapping their mouths as they tried and failed to come up with a response to Harry's flippancy. And has she been trying to influence you? The Hokage inquired after taking a moment to collect himself. No, the Kyubi has still not regained her full strength back, Harry replied as he dropped his playful tone. The only reason why she woke when she did was because Minato and I had been present within the seal. I also confirmed that she does not have access to my subconscious mind or memories thanks to my Kekkei Genkai, meaning that she won't be able to influence me through my dreams. I should also warn you that I fully intend to make contact with her again in order to learn as much as I can about her so that I can prepare Naruto for the moment when he inevitably meets the half of the Kyubi he holds. I'm going to ask that you wait until Jiraiya has had a chance to check the integrity of the seal before you seek to contact the Kyubi intentionally, the Hokage half-ordered as he fixed Harry with a stern gaze. I'm not foolish enough to forbid you from contacting your tenant, because I realize the value in gathering information, but I do not wish for you to take foolish risks that could place all of Konoha in danger should you accidentally unleash the Kyubi. I can't promise that I won't be drawn into the seal due to circumstances outside of my control, but I will promise that I will not actively seek to contact the Kyubi until Jiraiya has had a chance to look over the seal. I need to do a bit of research before I approach her out again anyway. I promise to provide her with a virtual hunting ground to keep her from getting bored while she's lounging about in the seal's cape. I learned the hard way that it is unwise to leave pets alone for too long because they tend to make bigger messes when they are bored. Pet. The Kyubi, pet. Kakashi incoherently gasped out in disbelief. Well, it's hard to see her as anything but a pet when she's shrunken down to the size of a cocker spaniel. She's a right little ankle biter when it comes down to it. I'm not even going to ask, Yamato deadpanned as he shifted his fingers just enough to glare at Harry through the hand he still had over his face. He then frowned a bit as he asked, did you actively draw on the Kyubi's chakra at all while you were within the seal? Not that I am aware of, Harry replied with a shrug of his shoulders. My clones didn't have any memories of me drawing on the Kyubi's chakra at any point after I fell unconscious. That is reassuring, the Sandaime murmured. Please keep me informed of any other developments in regards to your passenger. I will inform Jiraiya that his presence is needed in Konoha sooner, rather than later, and will inform you the moment I know when he will arrive. Wakarimasu, Hokage-sama. The Hokage then dismissed the 5 of them a second time. Just before he left the office, Harry was reminded not to miss his end-of-the-month appointment with Ibiki and to make an appointment to see Tsunade within the next 48 hours because he'd missed so many of his weekly sessions with her while he was on his mission. That was also a subtle hint that he needed to have a full medical evaluation done to ensure that he'd not suffered any lasting damage from his encounter with Gozu and Meizu, the Oni Kyudai, or his brief contact with the Kyubi. The moment they stepped outside of the Hokage's tower once more, Harry absently said goodbye to his teammates, which included a promise to meet up with them later to give them an explanation, before he apparat to the Namikaze ranch. Between one step and the next, he would spend an hour there checking up on the horses and checking in with his elves to make sure there had been no problems while he was gone. Once he was satisfied that everything was still running smoothly despite his longer-than-expected absence, Harry began wandering through the streets in the direction of the Namikaze wheelhouse. As he walked, his thoughts turned inwards as he considered his life here in the elemental nations. He also allowed his thoughts to return to those that he'd left behind in the outer countries. Guilt and shame filled him for a moment as it felt like he had abandoned them before he realized that it wasn't so much abandonment as it was drifting apart as they too had fallen out of contact with him. He hoped they didn't hate him for leaving them, but he knew he never would have fit in with that world after everything he had learned and experienced since meeting Naruto. Looking back now, Harry actually wondered if he ever really belonged in the magical world. Sure, he was a wizard, but just because he had magic did not mean that the wizarding world was his home. They didn't want him there. Not really. They wanted the boy who lived. And he had been sick and tired of being their scapegoat long before Naruto had turned up out of the blue and turned his life upside down even as he gave it direction. Oh, he still loved the magical world and he dearly missed his friends, and fully believed that they missed him in return, but he also knew now that he never would have been happy there. Not even if he'd never met Naruto. Not like he was here. And wasn't that rather shocking? When he'd first come to Konoha, he'd been prepared to forever hate the village and its people for what they had done to his cousin. And now here he was seeing the sprawling village as home. He'd dug his roots in deeply here. There was no way he could go back to the other side and leave his life here behind. The only thing that would make it better was if his old friends could join him here or at least come to visit him every now and then. He wouldn't even mind visiting them on the other side a time or two. After a while, Harry looked up and found himself just outside of the training grounds he'd claimed 2 years earlier, and he made a mental note to send a letter to his friends on the other side of the barrier before he turned his thoughts to more pressing matters, such as what he was going to do about the newly awakened Kurama. Right now, the fox wasn't really that much of a threat to his mind or his sanity, but Harry thought that had more to do with the fact that the bijou hadn't fully recovered from the 9 years of torment in the Shinigami's stomach and being sealed inside of Harry yet. He also wasn't arrogant enough to think that he'd earned the bijou's trust after one short exchange of insults, even if the fox had given him her name. If he hoped to actually gain the creature's trust enough to have her work with him, then he was going to have to follow through on his promise to make a mental equivalent of the room of requirement for her to romp around in so that she could run around and hunt to her heart's content. He would also have to make an effort to get to know the fox and give her just enough information about him and his life to satisfy her curiosity. The idea of trying to befriend the demon wasn't exactly a sane plan, but forcing the creature into submission and angering it further was just asking for trouble. That was especially true if he took into account his usual flip-flopping luck. Shaking his head, Harry shoved all thoughts of the Kyubi out of his mind for the moment. He needed a good night's rest before he tried to figure out how he was going to deal with his burden. Turning away from the empty clearing that he'd been staring at for who knew how long, Harry continued on his way home. His thoughts quickly turned towards his son at that point, and he soon began hurrying along as he recalled just how long it had been since he'd last seen Teddy. Harry would be tackled by a miniature blonde blur the moment he turned the corner and stepped onto the street that the Namikaze's wheelhouse occupied. The 23-year-old let out a laugh as he swept his 5-year-old son up into his arms and spun him around in a circle while hugging him tight. His arms tightened instinctively when he recalled how bad his most recent mission had turned and how much worse it could have been. He felt a brief flash of old anger as he recalled how Tazuna had lied about the mission before he stamped down on his irritation and buried his nose in Teddy's hair and breathed in his son's familiar scent. "I missed you, Tazuna," Teddy declared as he tried to burrow deeper into Harry's arms. "I missed you too, Squirt. You were gone forever. We ran into a little trouble on our mission and it took longer than expected to deal with everything. I don't think we'll be taking another mission out of the village for a while though. If we do, they shouldn't be anywhere near as long as this last one was. Promise." "No, I can't promise because I am not the one who usually picks which missions we take and there will be times when my team will need to take a longer mission. But I can promise that I'll be around for a couple of days at least since I've got a lot of work to catch up on after I was gone so long." "Okay," Teddy muttered with resignation. "So, what kind of trouble did you get into while I was gone? Have you been practicing your pranking?" "I got into all kinds of trouble when I put worms down Mai's dress after she teased Daichi about his new haircut and called him names. She squealed like a baby and danced all around until Sensei made her sit still so she could get the worms out. That's my boy, I'm proud of you for defending for others." The old worms down the dress is real a classic. Next time, you should try to be a bit sneakier about how you prank the bullies, that way you don't get into as much trouble. And I would consider an ant invasion instead of worms. They are less noticeable and require less work to get them onto a target since ants naturally swarm when disturbed. Fleas are also another good alternative since they are harder to see but they can be tricky because they're likely to jump targets. Just remember to avoid seriously hurting anyone or causing any permanent damage, so make certain your targets aren't allergic to any of the bugs you plan to use in case they get bit. "Wakata, Tazuna," Teddy agreed solemnly before he slithered out of Harry's arms and began dragging him up the stairs that led up to the apartments above the family restaurant. "Did I just hear you encourage your son to prank the other children?" a familiar voice demanded in amusement. "Of course, what kind of role model would I be if I encouraged my son to ignore blatant bullies?" Harry quipped in reply as he stopped walking and half-turned to face Yugugo when the vivacious Kunoichi dropped down onto the stairs from the roof. "Besides, it would be hypocritical of me to tell my son not to prank the bullies when he knows that I prank the bullies whenever I catch them in the act of bullying another." "You're incorrigible," Yugugo retorted with a snort of amusement. "I try," Harry modestly admitted as he tried to ignore the way his insides were tying themselves up in knots due to the little sexy smile of amusement that the Kunoichi was wearing. An impatient tug on his hand reminded him that Teddy wanted to spend time with him after the long separation. "I hate to cut our conversation short but my son's a little impatient for me to spend some time with him after I've been gone for nearly a full month." "Oh, that's okay," Yugugo murmured as a small blush dusted her cheeks and for a moment Harry thought she sounded disappointed. "I had only stopped by to see if you were up a spar after hearing that you were back since I had the rest of the day off but if you're busy. Normally, I would jump at the chance to train with you but I'd be setting myself up for some rather humiliating pranks from the squirt here if I ditched him to play with swords. Tomorrow then. So long as nothing else comes up, I can probably spare a couple of hours for a spar. I guess I'll see you tomorrow then. Or you could stick around and hang out with us for a bit," Harry offered before his brain caught up with his mouth. "If you don't have anything pressing to do and if you don't mind playing board games, that is." Demo, she's a girl, they have cooties," Teddy adamantly complained as he gave another tug on Harry's hand. "Shigo, it's only fangirls that have cooties. Yugugo, on the other hand, is a proper kunoichi and therefore 100% cootie-free. How can you be so sure?" "Well, you can always tell when a girl has cooties because the cooties get up into their brains and make them go all loopy and forget how to use their common sense. That's why they act all crazy around certain people. The more cooties they have in their brains, the worse they act around the person they are obsessing after." "Does that mean you've already been infected with cooties, Tazuna? You always act weird when Yugugo-san is around and you always say she's really, really pretty. Ajisen also always says you have it bad whenever Obasan mentions her name and you're not around. Remind me to prank your aunt and uncle for gossiping later." Harry growled in English as he felt his face heating up in embarrassment over his son's rather innocent questions and observations. To prevent his son from embarrassing him further, he quickly suggested, "Why don't you go pick out a game and set it up, Squirt? Teddy squealed in excitement before he dashed on up the stairs, leaving the mortified Chunin alone with his crush. He then cleared his throat and offered a nervous, "Sorry about that, apparently, I'm not the only one corrupting my son." "No apologies necessary, Takashi," Yugugo insisted as her lips curled up in a small smile. "In fact, I found your son's observations to be rather enlightening." You did?" "Most definitely. He even answered a question that has been plaguing me for quite some time." "He did?" "Yes, he did." "Would you like to know what that question was?" Yugugo agreed as she stepped closer to Harry, and he automatically backed up a step only for his back to collide with the wall. "Ah no. I don't know, maybe. Maybe not. You are so adorable when you get all flustered," Yugugo breathed with a soft laugh as she took another step closer and leaned towards him. "Ah no. Yugugo, what are you?" The rest of Harry's question was cut off by Yugugo pressing a finger to his mouth before she replaced her finger with her lips. Harry froze the moment he felt her soft lips press themselves against his. It had been over 4 years since he'd last kissed a girl. Harry's brain still hadn't quite recovered from the shock of Yugugo kissing him, let alone wanting to kiss him, when his body reacted to Yugugo's kiss on autopilot as his hands settled themselves on the kunoichi's hips and his mouth began actively participating in the kiss. He let out a soft moan a few seconds later when Yugugo pressed her body closer to his and deepened the kiss in response to his participation. Desire pooled in his belly as his brain simply shut itself off completely and his hands began gently kneading Yugugo's hips. Yugugo's hands slid across his chest before sliding over his shoulders where they gravitated to his neck, her fingers teasing the fine hairs at nape of his neck. A shiver raced down Harry's back and he let out another quiet moan that morphed into a soft whine when Yugugo broke the kiss and stepped back. "I will see you tomorrow afternoon for that spar, Takashi," Yugugo breathed before she gave him a second, chaste kiss on the cheek. After her lips pulled away this time, she leapt up to the roof at the same time as the door to the apartments above burst open. A split second later, Teddy stuck his head out the door to call out, "Hurry up, Tazuna." Harry opened his eyes, which he couldn't remember closing, and glanced up towards the impatient 5-year-old as he called back a slightly shaky, "Be right there, squirt." Teddy gave out a yip of excitement as he disappeared back inside of the apartment. Harry remained where he was for a moment as he reached up to brush his fingers across his lips while part of him wondered why Yugugo had kissed him. After another minute had passed, he pulled himself out of his thoughts and pushed himself away from the wall before he began trudging the rest of the way up the stairs, before Teddy came looking for him again. Just before he stepped through the door that Teddy had left open, Harry glanced towards the nearby rooftops for any sign of the kunoichi but sighed in disappointment when he didn't see her. Harry would remain rather distracted for the rest of the night as he played several rounds of mousetrap with Teddy and the rest of the children in the house. Chapter 34, Carnival Sideshow. Tuesday, September 2, 2003, mid-afternoon. Konoha no Sato, Hai no Kuni. Harry silently followed Yamato into the Hokage's office. The two of them had just been notified that Jiraiya had finally returned to the village. The wizard probably would have felt more than a little nervous about the coming meeting, since the results could affect his current standing in the village, if not for the fact that he was more than a little preoccupied by the continued absence of Yugugo. Harry hadn't seen or heard from the woman since she'd kissed him the day his team had returned from Nami and he was beginning to think that she was avoiding him. She'd not even shown up to spar with him the next day like she'd said she would. He would quickly shelve his long-held insecurities and growing frustration over her disappearance the moment he felt the Sandaime activate one of the more powerful barriers that protected his office from eavesdroppers. A brief scan of the office revealed that Tsunade, Inoichi, Ibiki, and Shikaku were in attendance in addition to the Hokage, Jiraiya, and Yamato. He was actually surprised that a number of the individuals he had expected to be present for this meeting were conspicuous in their absence, such as Kasai, the Hokage's advisors, and his former Umbu guards. Part of him was glad that Yugugo was not in attendance because he was certain he would have made a complete arse out of himself if she had been there. At the same time, her absence also made him wonder if she really was avoiding him. He quickly pushed the matter out of his mind a second time when the Hokage began speaking. "Now that we are all here, shall we get down to business?" The Hokage inquired as soon as Harry and Yamato finished greeting those present. A grimace briefly flashed across Harry's face before he began unbuckling the various blades he carried with him 95% of the time. A quick flick of his holly wand produced a side table for him to place the blades on. He then removed his dragon hide cloak and shirt next so that neither garment would get in Jiraiya's way as the man inspected the containment seal on his stomach. The last thing he did was put away the glass discs he used for his daily chakra control exercises. Harry felt a touch awkward standing in the middle of the Hokage's office half-dressed, but he easily ignored the feeling. 7 years on the Gryffindor Quidditch team and sharing a dorm with 4 other boys had long since inured him to being in a partial state of dress in front of others. He might have once felt highly uncomfortable being in such a state in front of Tsunade, but she'd quickly teased him out of his embarrassment within the first 4 months. He'd lived in the village thanks to the weekly appointments he'd had with her to monitor his chakra coils. That didn't stop the light flush from creeping up the back of his neck when he noticed the smirk on her face though. "Light em up, Takashi," Jiraiya instructed as he stepped up beside Harry so he would have a clear view of the wizard's stomach. Harry quickly complied with the gruff command as folded his hands together in the ram's seal and began circulating his chakra through his body. Within seconds of him actively channeling his chakra, the containment seal binding half of the Kyubi to his soul shimmered into existence on his abdomen. At first glance, the seal appeared identical to the Hack no Fuin Shiki adorning Naruto's stomach, but the moment one looked closer, they would notice several very small differences. The first difference was the number of turns that made up the spiral in the center of the design. The one on Naruto's stomach only had 2 full circles while Harry's had 3. The thickness of the lines making up the spirals were also slightly different. The lines on Naruto's were roughly a millimeter thicker than one on Harry's. Additionally, the mirrored Shushou Fuin that bracketed the spiral contained slightly different symbols. Finally, centered over top of the entire seal, in a razor-thin line that was barely visible, was a faint imprint of the Deathly Hallows symbol. Most of the differences were insignificant, a mere indication that the seals had been created under completely different circumstances and powered by 2 different chakra signatures. The inclusion of the Deathly Hallows symbol was what truly separated Harry's containment seal from Naruto's seal. That little addition was what would unleash the half of the Kyubi sealed inside of Harry upon his death. The symbol meant to act as a doorway between Harry's soul and the world the moment his body ceased to function. It was also the reason why Minato's soul was trapped in the world of the living and why his spirit was so tightly tied to Harry's body. Unknown to both wizard and ghost, it was also the death magic in the Hallows that prevented Minato's ghost from becoming a vengeful spirit since his soul lacked the magic necessary to stabilize his presence in the land of the living. Without that link, Minato would have lost all sense of self within the first 3 months of his release from the Shinigami's stomach. The first time Jiraiya had noticed the faint symbol of the Hallows, the older man had freaked out a bit. Apparently, the Deathly Hallows symbol looked very similar to the symbol used by a particularly nasty cult that worshipped an unpleasant god by the name of Jashin. The symbol of Jashin consisted of an upside-down triangle inside of a circle. Once Jiraiya had calmed down enough to note that the symbol of the Hallows consisted of a vertical line bisecting a circle inside of a right-side-up triangle, he calmed down and questioned Harry about his symbol. At the time, Harry had still been rather mistrustful though, and all he'd told Jiraiya was that the symbol was meant to represent death in the society into which he'd been born. It was the truth, but it was not the full truth, since the Hallows represented so much more than just death. They were also a representation of humanity's fear of death and the inherent need and desire to survive that most humans embraced throughout their lives. That is not to say that all humans desired immortality, they didn't. It just meant that they wished to survive on an instinctual level. There were, of course, exceptions. Sometimes, people lost their will to live. Other times, people just didn't have the strength to keep going. That was only natural though. Death, as frightening and final as it is, was merely one aspect of life. A person is born, they live, and then they die. That was the truth that Harry had accepted when he'd walked out to offer himself up to Voldemort in order to destroy the final Horcrux in his scar. Harry hadn't felt a need to explain all of that to Jiraiya at the time though. It wasn't that he didn't think the man would understand, because if anyone could understand the cycle of life and death, it would be a shinobi. He just hadn't wanted anyone to reach the conclusion that he technically died for a brief moment. He had also had no desire to let anyone outside of the family know that the Hallows both existed and that he owned all 3. The power they represented was far too tempting and he had no way of knowing if there were any other magicals living in the elemental countries. The 23-year-old was drawn out of his musings a moment later as Jiraiya announced, "The seal is still stable and it shows no signs of degradation or stress." "That is good to know," the Hokage murmured with more than a little relief. "Takashi, would you be willing to share your impressions of the Kyubi with us?" Shikaku requested with obvious interest. The half of the Kyubi that is sealed in me is female, Harry absently corrected as he ceased circulating his chakra and dropped his hands now that Jiraiya had finished inspecting the seal. As for my impression of the fox, she is proud, very proud. She was also angry and confrontational. I would almost dare to say that she was confused and uncertain of what to make of me because she does not have access to my memories or my subconsciousness. The most notable thing I noticed was that she was still rather exhausted. Tsunade repeated incredulously. What? Were you expecting the Kyubi to be asexual simply because she is not human? TCH, next you'll tell us that it has a name too. She does, but I don't have permission to share her name with you, Harry retorted with a small smirk when he noted the brief look of shock that passed over the woman's face. Getting her to tell me her name was like pulling teeth from a rabid squirrel in a peanut factory. She also has a mild aversion to the color pink. It is a shame that I cannot view your memories of your encounter with the creature, Inoichi lamented absently. And I am thankful for the protection the Kyubi's mere presence offers my mind from such intrusions, Harry countered flatly as he briefly glanced at the blonde. Did you notice any anomalies during Takashi's most recent medical assessment, Tsunade? The Sandaime inquired to bring the meeting back on topic. Yes, the amount of stress that the steady influx of demonic chakra has been placing on Takashi's chakra coils was halved. I do not know if the reduction is permanent or temporary though, and will continue to monitor the situation for the next month or two to ensure that any significant fluctuations won't cause serious damage to his chakra network. Do you know what caused the drastic change or when the change occurred? Shikaku asked as he glanced between Harry and the kunoichi. No, Takashi. No clue, I can't sense any difference in the flow of the Kyubi's chakra that is mingling with mine. Could it be the result of the Kyubi waking up and attempting to reclaim or withhold her chakra from the seals in an attempt to build up the power she would need to break free of the seal or influence her host? Yamato inquired as he immediately jumped to the worst-case scenario in order to prepare for the worst, a mindset that most high-level shinobi fell into since it increased their chances of survival. No, the Biju's state of consciousness should not have had any impact upon the seal's basic function, Jiraiya refuted without an ounce of hesitation. On top of that, I took time to place a few security measures while I was trapped within the seal's cape, Harry added nonchalantly as he pulled his shirt and cloak back on before he buckled his swords back into place. What did you do? Shikaku half demanded as he almost dropped his lazy facade. I collared the Kyubi with binding seals and created a leash that allows me to control exactly how much of her chakra she has access to. I could, theoretically, strip her of her chakra entirely if it should prove necessary. The best part is that she willingly allowed herself to be tied the moment she gave into her curiosity, which means that the bindings are far stronger than they would have been if I had attempted to force them on her. Additionally, the new seals are set up in such a way that they will automatically strip the Kyubi of her chakra in the event that someone attempts to remove her from the seal. They should also activate upon my death and leave the Kyubi powerless the moment she leaves the seal. Are you implying that you basically neutered the Kyubi with its consent? Jiraiya demanded in shock. Well, technically, you'd have to say I had her spayed. She is female. I take my responsibilities as a pet owner very serious, you know. Would you please stop referring to the Kyubi as your pet? The Hokage requested, his voice containing an obvious note of discomfort in regards to Harry's irreverent references to the half of the Kyubi sealed inside of him. I make no promises, Hokage-sama. The older man glowered at Harry for a brief moment before he addressed Jiraiya once more. You are certain that the containment seal is stable? Hi, Sensei. Are you still determined to establish further contact with your prisoner, Takashi? Yes, I believe the best way to prepare Naruto for the day he inevitably faces the half of the Kyubi that he holds is for me to learn as much as I can from the half that I hold. And the best way to do that is for me to speak with my passenger and compare what I learned from her with what I have learned about the Kyubi from Mito-sama and Kushina-san. You will also need to start learning how to access, use, and control the Kyubi's chakra, Jiraiya mused in a thoughtful tone. He'll do no such thing until I am 100% certain that his chakra network has fully adjusted to the constant influx of the Kyubi's chakra into his system. Tsunade interjected with a growl as she glared at her teammate. The last thing we need is you pushing him too far, too soon when a single miscalculation could potentially shatter his coils. I wasn't implying that he should begin drawing on the Kyubi's chakra right this instant, Haim. It would be best to work on that outside of the village in any case, Shikaku added as he gestured at the sprawling view of the village that filled more than half of the office's windows. No need to incite panic in the village now that things have finally settled down after all of the upheavals over the past 15 years. We can discuss Takashi's training later. Right now I am more concerned about his planned attempt to intentionally contact the bijou he holds, the Hokage stated before the argument could continue. To that extent, I would like for Jiraiya, Tsunade, and Yamato to monitor the attempt so that we can monitor your health throughout the process and so that the Kyubi's chakra can be suppressed in the event that you unconsciously draw upon the fox's chakra during the encounter. We'll need to set him up in a remote location that either has medical equipment already in place or the space to bring in the medical equipment necessary for me to monitor him, Tsunade stated as she eyed Harry for a moment. There is a medical facility located in the basement of the exam tower within the Forest of Death, Ibiki pointed out. It is also outside of the village's defensive barrier, which means that any flare-ups of the Kyubi's chakra will be less likely to be noticed inside of the village. And I request permission to be present during Takashi's attempt to make contact with the Kyubi. What am I, a carnival sideshow? What's next? Are you going to sell tickets and offer free popcorn and peanuts to the audience? Oh, don't be ridiculous, Gaki, Shikaku drawled around a laugh. We'd need to hire a bookie first so that we can place bets on whether or not your infamous flip-flopping luck is going to play up during the attempt. I hate you, Shikaku, Harry deadpanned as he shot the man a mock glare. Just for that, I'm not going to let you bully me into playing another game of shogi with you for at least a month. How much time would you need to prepare? The Hokage inquired as he smothered what suspiciously sounded like a laugh. I'm ready now, but the rest of the circus needs to get their act together, Harry answered around a sigh. I am ready now, as well, Yamato stated without hesitation. It will take me 2 hours tops to calibrate the equipment in the infirmary since I can bring Shizen along to help me get things set up, Tsunade replied next. I should be able to cobble together a seal capable of suppressing the Kyubi's chakra within 2 hours, Jiraiya added on the heels of Tsunade's reply. I will clear my schedule for the rest of the afternoon and head to the exam tower to secure the facility and evacuate the forest, Ibiki offered after a brief conversation with Inoichi. I will deploy 2 squads to patrol the perimeter of Training Ground 44 just in case things get out of hand and to keep everyone else out during the encounter, Shikaku stated on the heels of Ibiki's declaration. Very well, the Hokage acknowledged. I wish you good luck in your endeavor. Please send word when the venture is over so that I can arrange for us to meet again to discuss the results within the next day or two. Hi, Hokage-sama, all of those involved stated in unison as the privacy barrier was deactivated. 2 hours and 15 minutes later, Harry was once again wearing nothing but his pants as he sat on a hospital gurney while Shizen hooked him up to an assortment of medical equipment that would be monitoring his vital signs. The green-eyed wizard tried not to squirm in discomfort while he waited for her to finish. He would have been happier to meet with the Kyubi in the privacy of his own bed, but he understood why the Hokage wanted him to be closely monitored during the attempt. That didn't make him feel like any less of a freak show at the moment though. Alright, that's the last of them, go ahead and lay down, Shizen stated as she began fiddling with the various machines to make certain they were functioning properly. It would be another 5 minutes before Harry was given the go-ahead and the wizard took a deep breath before he closed his eyes and let his consciousness sink into his mindscape. Once he reached the inner sanctuary of his mind, which his Japanese tutors had helped him set up during the 2 years he'd spent in Japan, he took a moment to assess his mental defenses before he attempted to shift from his mindscape to the seal's cape where the Kyubi was located. Harry found himself standing just outside of the chamber of seals a heartbeat later. Instead of just walking right in, Harry took a moment to study the heavy door to the chamber. Like the door it was modeled after, the door to the chamber of seals was large, round, and made from reinforced steel. Instead of a snake motif though, the door in the seal's cape was decorated with an etching of the Deathly Hallows symbol superimposed over the silhouette of a fox head. The fox was inlaid with red jade shaped like licks of flames while the symbol of the Hallows was inlaid with obsidian and outlined with silver. The last thing Harry noticed was that the door was locked in the open position by a string of seals that he didn't recognize. The wizard-turned-shinobi made a mental note to copy the memory of the seals so that he could create a physical copy of them in order to see if Jiraiya could offer any insight on what they were meant to do. He then stepped through the door and made his way to the raised dais in the middle of the room. He was more than a little surprised when he found the Kyubi sitting exactly where he'd left her when he finally had a clear view of the chairs on the dais. So you have returned to gloat, have you? Kurama demanded as she glared at him from her seat. Gloat? No, I am here because I promised to create a place for you to run and hunt. Harry countered as he calmly sat down and tried to figure out what it was that had the Kyubi's tails in a knot, figuratively speaking. May I inquire why you think I have any reason to gloat? Do not try to play me for a fool, wizard, you know exactly what you have done, Kurama snarled as she jumped up onto the table that separated them, her actions prompting Harry to draw his mental representation of the Elder Wand. Actually, I don't. The miniature Kyubi growled and lunged at Harry in fury in response to his reply. Harry was prepared and the furious fox slammed into an invisible shield that Harry had silently cast the moment he'd seen her muscles bunching. He then conjured a dozen chains to bind the fox to the table. Kurama howled and snarled in fury the moment the chains wrapped around her and all 9 of her tails. Harry knew the fact that he'd used chains to bind her was adding insult to injury. Kushina had used chakra chains to bind the Kyubi on more than one occasion. Release me this instant, you thieving flesh bag. Kurama ordered as she continued to writhe in her chains. I warned you that the Kyubi was nothing but trouble, Minato intoned from where he'd been leaning against the entrance since right about the time Harry had sat down. The shade had once again been drawn along for the ride shortly after Harry had entered the Seal's Cape. Shigo, your son is nothing but trouble. This here is a minor irritant that I will eradicate in 5.2 seconds if she doesn't calm down and shut her foul mouth. I am immortal. No mere mortal could destroy me. The moment you try, you will die and I will be free to destroy everything you ever held dear. I will give you one last chance to calm down and then I will strip every ounce of chakra from your soul, reduce you to the size of a mouse, lock you in jam jar, and permanently seal you inside of my tailbone for all eternity. And before you rant on about how my bones will one day turn to dust and free you, know that I have ways of preserving and reinforcing my bones to prevent them from decaying or being destroyed. Silence immediately fell over the Seal's Cape as the demonic fox snapped her mouth shut and ceased all attempts to escape the chains. Harry felt relieved that Kurama had taken his threat seriously but gave no outward indication of his emotions. It wouldn't do to allow the fox a chance to perceive him as weak because of his emotions, after all. While he waited for the Kyubi to finish calming down, Harry conjured himself a cup of strong black tea to help calm his nerves and give his hand something to do in order to hide said nerves. Once it appeared that the Kyubi was no longer in a blind rage, Harry met her gaze and calmly asked, will you be able to keep control of yourself or shall I leave you in chains for the duration of my visit? I don't care what you do, one more indignity heaped upon me by a wretched cheat would hardly matter, Kurama spat, her voice thick with resentment. Then I hope you're comfortable because I am in no mood to cater to your whims and if you are going to act like a prissy little princess throwing a temper tantrum of epic proportions, then I will treat you like the rabid dog you are and slap a muzzle on you to go with your chains. I may believe in equality between sentient species but I will not roll over and bare my throat to you, or anyone else, for any reason. I can and will make your life a living hell if you ever attempt to attack me again. Got it? Kurama let out a half-hearted growl before she fell silent once more. Glad to see you can be properly trained. Now, what exactly was it that got your tails in a knot? The fox merely snarled silently at Harry instead of answering. The wizard sighed as he stood up and turned his back on the bijou as he approached the right-hand wall where the images of Kurama's life were hung. He'd let the damn fox stew for a bit while he set about creating the promised hunting grounds for her. He'd set several dozen clones to researching a way to recreate a mental version of the Room of Requirement but had not been able to find any hints or clues, not surprising, since that knowledge had been lost long before Harry's great-great-grandfather had attended Hogwarts. Instead, they'd come up with a combination of runes and enchantments that would allow him to recreate different types of environmental regions such as a desert, forest, cave, or beach. The only catch was that each region would have to be set up in a separate room. In order to make certain there was enough room for the various environments, Harry had decided to recreate the pipe system that led out of the Chamber of Secrets here in the Chamber of Seals. The first thing he did was shift the murals of Kurama's life up higher to make room for the pipes. He then created half a dozen tunnels that were 10 feet in diameter, 20 feet long, and evenly spaced out along the wall. Next, he affixed round doors that were modeled after the entrance door to each tunnel opening, added a doggy door to each door, for convenience, and labeled each door with the type of environment that would be created inside of the tunnel behind the door. He then selected a tunnel at random and set about expanding the interior before he created a couple of dozen clones to help him apply the runes, spells, and enchantments needed to transform the oversized stone pipe into an appropriate outdoor environment. In this case, the tunnel was being transformed into a seemingly endless field of wild grasses that was designated simply as grassland. He'd chosen to create that environment first since he thought the Kyubi would appreciate having a wide open space to run around in. Once he had finished creating that first room, all that was missing from the artificial grassland were those animals and insects that lived in such an environment. Harry was not yet certain exactly how he was going to create those animals though, since they would need to be far more complex than the landscaping of the room. The animals would need to mimic their living counterparts, after all, and Harry didn't know enough about the behavioral patterns of the various species he planned to include to recreate realistic copies of them. Dismissing his clones, Harry returned to the main chamber and quietly retook his seat on the dais as he studied the still fuming fox. Once he was comfortable and had a fresh cup of tea in hand, Harry pinned the Kyubi with a stern gaze as he addressed her once more. "Are you going to answer my earlier question now, or shall I leave you chained to the table until the next time I return to the Chamber of Seals for a visit?" "You are just as cowardly and treacherous as the Uchiha and their cursed eyes," Kurama growled in a near hiss. "Explain or I will rip the knowledge from your mind myself because I am growing weary of your attitude. There is nothing to explain, for your threats have only confirmed that you are just like every other human out there. You crave the power of others for yourself, and what is not freely given to you, you take by force and trickery." "What a surprisingly human sentiment," Harry drawled in a dismissive tone as he tried to determine whether or not the fox was making her first attempt at manipulating him. "I did not think one such as yourself would cling to the human ideal of fairness or fair play. And you are wrong, I have never craved power for myself. Liar. No, I may stretch the truth from time to time, but I do not tell lies. There is no need for me to lie. In that case, give me back my chakra." "I did not steal your chakra. It's sitting right where you left it," Harry pointed out with a frown as he glanced towards the towering cage that still held a transparent copy of the Kyubi's true form. "You and your cursed tricks locked me out." "No, I did not." "Actually, you might have done just that, cousin," Minato interjected from the doorway. "The seal was designed to hold the Kyubi in place, and the alteration you made to the seal in order to allow the fox to leave the physical representation of the seal, which was the cage, may well have made the changes you forced upon the Kyubi permanent. After all, the seal was not designed to be a revolving door." "Huh," Harry blurted out in surprise, that was certainly not what he'd intended. "Release me and give me back my chakra, worm," Kurama ordered as she wriggled in her chains. "No, I don't think I will," Harry countered as he focused his attention on the Kyubi once more. "You have no need of that power while you are here in the seal's cape, and I have no intention of ever letting you out of the seal entirely. I may not have intended to permanently separate you from your chakra, but what is done. And before you curse and wail about trickery, you do well to remember that you willingly left your cage and your chakra." Harry rose to his feet and made his way to the exit at that point. He'd spent more than enough time in the demon's presence, and he needed to discuss this latest twist with someone who has a far better grasp on the principles behind the containment seal. He also needed to call on Mito or Kushina's spirit to get a better idea of what kind of consequences he could expect to face due to the way he'd inadvertently stripped the fox of her chakra. Once he reached the doorway, Harry stopped and glanced back at the Kyubi as he stated, "I will let your attempt to attack me slide this time since your anger was justifiable under the circumstances. However, if you should ever try to attack me again, I will carry through on every single one of my threats." He then flicked his wand at the table to vanish the chains restraining the Kyubi before he stepped through the open door and returned his consciousness to his mindscape. Harry took a moment to center his emotions and thoughts before he exited the meditative state he'd put himself in to access both his mind and the seal's cape. He opened his eyes a heartbeat later and stared up at the ceiling of the underground medical facility as he felt the first tendrils of a migraine forming. "Well, how did it go?" Jiraiya inquired from where he had been leaning against the gurney during the process. "Not well, I apparently caught the Kyubi at the wrong time of the month," Harry replied as he gingerly sat up in order to avoid aggravating the headache he now had. "Maybe I should have offered her chocolate." Tsunade walked up and slapped the back of his head in irritation over his sexist comment. "Damn it, woman, don't do that. Don't take that tone with me, mister, or I will put you in traction for a month." Tsunade barked as she coated her hands in healing chakra and began a cursory diagnostic scan to determine if his recent trip into the seal's cape had a negative impact on his body or chakra network. "You've been spending far too much time with Shikaku if you've picked up his habit of addressing women as woman to their face." "Shigo, I picked up that particular habit from my best friend while we were still in our early teens. Was the Kyubi's attitude significantly different this time when compared to the first time you met with the bijou face to face? Yamato asked from his position near the door. Yeah, she was in a right pissy mood this time. She attempted to attack me shortly after I entered the seal. Apparently, I made a tiny miscalculation when I set up the security measures I mentioned earlier. Instead of creating a way for me to limit the amount of power she has access to, I removed her power completely and locked it away out of her reach. She was not happy about that. So you really did have her spayed? Jiraiya asked with some surprise. It would seem so, but I have no idea what that means for me aside from the fact that I might need to invest in a muzzle if she makes further attempts to chew my face off. It also makes me worry about the level of hostility that Naruto will have to face when he finally comes into contact with his half of the Kyubi. Do you still plan to make additional attempts to speak with the demon? Ibiki inquired with a touch of concern. Yes, there is no point in avoiding her since she isn't going anywhere. How long are you going to wait before you meet with her again? Not for another month or two. There are a number of things I need to research before I go back into the seal, and I need to speak with Mito-sama, Kushina-san, or another former Jinchuriki in order to learn what kind of repercussions I can expect from separating the Kyubi from her chakra. Send me a note when you are about ready to make another visit and I will return to the village to keep an eye on things again. Jiraiya instructed in a serious tone as gestured for Harry to channel chakra into the seal so that he could recheck the stability of the seal once more now that Tsunade had finished scanning him. Tsunadeheim, were there any further changes to his chakra coils? No, I've picked up nothing new. And there is still no change in the seal, Jiraiya added a moment later. You can go ahead and stop channeling your chakra now, Takashi. Was there anything else you needed from me, or can I get dressed now? We're done with you, for now. I do expect to see you as scheduled this Friday though, so I can log any further changes in the fluctuations of the Kyubi's chakra and the state of your chakra coils, Tsunade stated in reply to Harry's question. Do you have any plans for the evening? Ibiki inquired before Harry could confirm his weekly appointment with the kunoichi. Not really. Why? I wish to sit down and discuss your 2 meetings with the Kyubi so that I can document everything that you learned and analyze your interactions with the fox. I also wish to hear more about your game plan for any future visits you will be paying to the Kyubi and what you expect to learn and accomplish through such visits. Joy, Harry muttered as he removed the final electrode and pulled on his shirt. I guess I can spare a couple of hours after supper. Where would you like me to meet you? My office, and bring your predecessors with you. I would like to hear their opinions on the stunt you pulled on the fox. Wakata. That's it for part 9. Thank you for watching and see you in the next video.